8 mice were placed into an environment where nothing could threaten their survival. There was unlimited food, unlimited water, stable temperature, no predators, no disease, every survival pressure removed. It was a perfectly controlled ecosystem designed for stability and growth. If survival depended only on resources, this should have been the safest society ever created. But within a few years, every single mouse inside was dead. No starvation, no infection, no visible cause. The system didn't fail because something went wrong. It failed because something essential was missing, and no one noticed it until it was too late. This experiment was part of a long-term study on population dynamics and social behavior. The goal wasn't just to observe growth, but to understand what happens when scarcity disappears completely. Because in nature, pressure shapes behavior. Scarcity creates structure. Remove those pressures, and the question becomes uncomfortable. Does a system improve, or does it begin to break in ways that are harder to detect? That question had already followed the researcher through more than 24 earlier experiments, and every time, the pattern looked disturbingly similar. The environment itself was engineered with precision, structured living spaces, vertical nesting areas, interconnected pathways, constant resource availability. Everything was optimized. It wasn't just about survival, it was about eliminating friction. The space could support thousands. The starting group was small, just 8 mice, all healthy, all stable. The expectation was simple: steady population growth, followed by equilibrium. But that assumption carried a hidden risk, because stability doesn't always come from abundance. Sometimes it comes from limitation. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The mice explored, adapted, and established basic social patterns. For a while, the system looked exactly like it should. Then reproduction began. The first litters appeared, and the population started increasing. Slowly at first, then faster, then predictably. The numbers doubled, then doubled again. What began as a controlled environment was quickly becoming dense with activity. And on the surface, that looked like success. But growth alone doesn't mean stability. Sometimes it hides the beginning of collapse. As population density increased, the structure of the system started to shift. In natural environments, overcrowding triggers expansion. Some individuals leave, reducing internal pressure. But here, there was no outside, no escape. The system was closed, and when expansion isn't possible, pressure doesn't disappear, it builds. The first signs of that pressure didn't look dramatic. They looked subtle, easy to ignore, but they marked the beginning of something irreversible. A group of younger males began to withdraw from normal behavior. They stopped competing, stopped defending territory, stopped responding to conflict. When attacked, they didn't fight back. They absorbed the damage, moved away, and returned to a passive state. They were physically healthy, well-fed, fully capable, but behaviorally disengaged. They formed clusters, doing nothing. No purpose, no role, no interaction. And what made it more disturbing was this: nothing was forcing them to stop. They simply did. At the same time, another pattern emerged at the opposite extreme. Some males became hyperactive and unstable. Aggression increased, but without structure. They disrupted nests, ignored social boundaries, and acted without restraint. This wasn't dominance behavior, it was chaos. The balance that normally exists between competition and order began to disappear. And when that balance goes, the system doesn't stabilize, it fragments. The females responded differently, but just as significantly. Some began withdrawing from the system entirely. They moved to isolated areas, reducing interaction. Reproductive behavior declined. Maternal patterns changed. Raising offspring became harder in an environment where social structure was breaking down. And this is where the shift became critical, because when reproduction becomes unstable, the future of the system becomes uncertain. Then maternal behavior itself started to fail. Some mothers abandoned their young, others lost track of them. In some cases, recognition broke down completely. Offspring survival rates dropped sharply. This wasn't due to lack of resources. Food was still abundant. The environment was still stable. but the behavioral framework that supports reproduction was deteriorating. And without that framework, survival at the population level becomes impossible even if individuals are still alive. Another unexpected shift appeared around resource usage. Food was evenly distributed, available everywhere, but the mice didn't use it that way. They began clustering around specific feeding points, ignoring identical resources nearby. Crowding intensified in certain areas, while others remained empty. This wasn't a resource problem, it was a behavioral one. Their instincts had changed. Survival was no longer driving their actions. Something else was. As new generations grew up in this environment, the effects became more extreme. These mice had never experienced stable social roles. They had no reference point for functional behavior. And then a new type emerged mice that looked physically perfect but were completely disengaged from everything. No mating, no conflict, no interaction. They spent their time eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves constantly. Their appearance was flawless, their behavior was empty. They were alive, but they were no longer part of the system. This marked the point where recovery stopped being possible. The population had not just changed, it had lost its ability to function. Social roles had disappeared, reproductive behavior had collapsed. Interaction no longer supported survival, and when a system reaches that state, it doesn't matter how many resources remain, it can't sustain itself anymore. Eventually, the population reached its peak, and then it stopped growing. Reproduction slowed, then ended completely. No new offspring were born. The existing population aged. One by one, individuals died, the environment stayed the same, food was still there, water was still there, nothing external had changed. But the system was now in decline, and there was nothing left inside it to reverse that. In the end, every mouse was gone. The enclosure didn't fail, the resources didn't fail. What failed was the structure that gave each individual a role within the system. Because survival isn't just about having enough, it's about having a reason to act, to compete, to reproduce, to participate. Remove that, and the system doesn't collapse immediately. It collapses quietly, in stages, long before the final outcome becomes visible. And that's what makes this experiment difficult to ignore, because it doesn't show what happens when things go wrong. It shows what happens when everything seems right, but something essential is missing.